Welcome everyone to this final moral injury webinar this spring term, uh, which is hosted by the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School. I'm Rita Brock, Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Recovery Programs at Volunteers of America. Our Shea Moral Injury Center at VOA has co-sponsored these webinars by providing Zoom technical support from Sam McAllister, who works for the Shea Center. I'm welcoming you today instead of Nancy Ramsay, the director of the Soul Repair Center, because she is our featured speaker, so she shouldn't have to introduce herself. The Reverend Dr. Nancy Ramsay is Emerita Professor of Pastoral Theology and Pastoral Care at Brite Divinity School and director of the Soul Repair Center. She began her service at Brite in June of 2005 as Executive Vice President and Dean, until she stepped down from the deanship and retired in 2012. Prior to that time, sorry, she didn't retire from her job in 2012. She stepped down as dean in 2012. Prior to that time, she was professor of pastoral theology at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. She holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University and was chair of the steering committee of the Society for Pastoral Theology. She co-edited the Journal of Pastoral Theology, is a member of the Association of Practical Theology and the International Association for Practical Theology, and holds clinical memberships in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors and the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, where she also has supervisor status. Nancy's research and publications interests include constructive issues in pastoral and practical theology, pastoral perspectives on aging and Alzheimer's disease, gender, intimate violence, addressing issues of race and class, and effective pedagogy in diverse classrooms. She has also been a consultant for the Wabash Center on Effective Teaching and Learning in Racially and Culturally Diverse Classrooms. But the main reason I'm here to introduce her is out of a profound sense of gratitude for everything she has done to make the Soul Repair Center possible at Brite and help it flourish. When I co-founded the Soul Repair Center in 2012 with my friend of beloved memory, Chaplain Herman Kaiser Jr., Nancy was a major reason it found a home at Brite. We had a grant from Lilly with a number of schools interested in being a home for the center, but Nancy immediately, when she heard about it, asked me to come and present the proposal to her faculty, and they voted to accept it within 2 weeks. So Brite jumped first, and that's how we wound up at Brite, which has been a wonderful home for the center. When we opened in June, Nancy had just stepped down as dean and agreed to chair an advisory board for the center. And as if that weren't enough, Nancy suggested maybe it would be a good idea to convene a group of senior professors of pastoral theology to introduce them to the concept of moral injury and get that whole field stirred up about it. She recruited a dozen distinguished scholars from 3 religions, which resulted in several important books on moral injury. So her contributions to the Soul Repair Center and to the work of moral injury has been enormous. And it's an amazing legacy she leaves for the work she's done. And so she's going to today help us look back at especially the webinars and the various kinds of amazing things that she's been able to achieve in these webinars. So I give you Nancy Ramsay. Welcome, Nancy, to your own webinar.
Thank you, Rita. As usual, Rita is way too generous, and it was always a shared effort between Rita and Kyle Fauntleroy, our wonderful colleague at Brite. And I'm grateful for the many persons that we've met since we began these. But also, Rita's correct to say that that working group was quite generative. And I think the book that we put together has been a very valuable resource. It's my privilege today to talk about what I've learned as I've worked and journeyed with Rita on this topic. And I look forward to your comments after after I've been able to go through this review. It's been a privilege, as I said, to serve as the director of the Soul Repair Center after our founding director, Dr. Rita Brock, moved to serve as senior vice president and director of the Shea Center at Volunteers of America, where she now serves as a senior vice president. When Rita came to Brite, as she said, I was serving as executive vice president and the academic dean and a professor on the faculty. And I immediately, through the lens of those fields, recognized the value of what she was putting together. And we worked together and built a board, which she then asked me to chair. We collaborated as we imagined and promoted national conferences in locations such as Fort Worth, Kansas City, and Denver in order to widen awareness of military moral injury. When Dr. Brock moved to Volunteers of America as a senior vice president and director of the Shea Center, it was my honor to move into directing the center and the board. When COVID closed opportunities for in-person programming, Dr. Brock was able to arrange the services of her colleague at VOA, Sam McAllister, who produces our webinars so skillfully. All prior webinars, I remind you, are available on the websites of VOA and Brite. Before I say more about our webinars, it's important to acknowledge remarkable colleagues at Brite who are integral to the success of our center. The Reverend Kyle Fauntleroy, retired captain in the U.S. Navy chaplaincy and a director of development at Brite, is certainly first among them. Kyle is a conversation partner who offered wise advice and always seemed to know possible presenters as I would begin building our presentation and presenter list for each year. Many of you know him as the person who monitors the chat function during our webinars. I'm also grateful to Vanessa Daly, Director of Communications at Brite, whose expertise is woven through the organization of the website. She develops each slide that reaches our audience, which now stretches from the Pacific Islands to Eastern Europe. And she found ways to organize the website for research that brings many to our site. On the Soul Repair Center page on Brite's website and at VOA, you find access to all prior webinars, as well as those who serve on our board. She also developed our site on Facebook, which widens our access. Since we launched our webinars in November of 2020, our goal has been to develop resources that will support veterans and their families, military and VA chaplaincy training programs, religious leaders across the Abrahamic traditions, and military and VA chaplains as they encounter people whose experience is informed by or arises from moral injury. My hope continues to be that religious leaders across the Abrahamic traditions also consider our site because veterans and their families are in the congregations they serve. The document listing thematic categories for our webinars, 11/20/20 through February 2025, which we have shared with the slide announcing this program, provides a way of ordering the range of our webinars. Of course, the programming will resume next month and expand further. At both the VOA and Brite websites, you will find access to all prior webinars for viewing. As I recruited webinars, my goal was to provide not only timely resources for our reflection together, but also resources for teaching and research and ministry across the Abrahamic traditions. Alongside the development of webinars, with Dr. Brock's support, we also developed a written resource, Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care, a resource for religious leaders and professional caregivers, co-edited by Dr. Carrie Doring and me. The contributors reflect on resources drawn from the three faiths of the Abrahamic tradition, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. This publication provides a very valuable window into both the experience of moral injury and strategies for walking beside those who experience its harm. I hope you are already acquainted with that resource, but if not, I hope you will find it and look into those chapters because I'm confident that you'll find there resources relevant for the work that you do, whether in a chaplaincy setting, or in a congregation. My goal today is simply to expand a bit on how colleagues and I discern the topics and leadership for the webinars. And I also hope your wisdom in the conversation following my presentation will provide guidance for the next director. I invite you to use the attached list of webinars as I reflect on their contribution and ongoing helpfulness. From the beginning, I realized that the success of the webinars would depend on the wisdom of veterans and active duty personnel. This also meant relying on informed people in each of the armed forces to understand the goals of the webinars and to help me connect with colleagues whom they would recommend. I know my request required finding time in a challenging schedule. However, they share my commitment to provide care deeply informed by the consequences of moral injury. And the focus of the webinars reflects the wisdom of these consultants in each of the branches of the military, as well as colleagues in the VA. And I am so grateful to them. Especially I do appreciate the value of the wisdom of VA chaplains and training programs for them, such as the one that Dr. Keith Metter leads at Vanderbilt. Our program is enriched by the wisdom of these VA chaplains who walk beside and listen closely to veterans, who know firsthand the morally injurious consequences of war. For those of you who are religious leaders and hospital chaplains, caring for veterans and their families, I especially encourage you to learn from these webinars, to listen for the themes that arise, perhaps listen also for the silence as a veteran struggles with whether to trust you with memories that haunt them. My journey with these conversations also includes conversations initiated by personnel who had experienced moral injury. I'm deeply grateful for their courage and their honesty. Early on, that meant many conversations about military sexual trauma. I'm grateful for the courage of the women and men who talked with me. I'm also relieved that Congress acted to provide a much safer opportunity to report harm through the presence of special prosecutors who provide a far more secure opportunity to report sexual misconduct. Our webinar last month, addressing military sexual trauma in the Naval Academy, illustrates the scope of this particular and far too frequent form of moral injury. These conversations helped me understand power of both forms of moral injury, agential and receptive. Agential being actions we take that we realize caused harm and suffering. Receptive being our experience of the harm we experience from the actions of others, especially those we have reason to trust. An especially powerful webinar that reflects on agential moral injury would be the one featuring a film created by veterans, What We Want You to Know, that describes their experience in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. Their service put them in close contact with civilians who bore the brunt of conflict. They described the challenge of living with those memories as they obeyed. And I asked them early in the work of the center when I remember an early opportunity in our work at the center when I was attending a conference for providers of pastoral care that was in Norfolk. And it resonates with what these veterans described to me from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. During a break, I found myself beside Navy personnel in uniform, and I asked them what they thought about the idea of military moral injury. At that point, they had not heard of it. But as I described the concept, together they said, That sounds like my dad. Veteran Michael Yandel's chapter in Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care, a resource for religious leaders and professional caregivers, 2019, Moral Injury and a Human Relationship, a Conversation, where he reflects on his essay about combat in Iraq, and in 2015 in the Christian Century, The War Within. Dr. Yandel helps to voice the reality and challenge of receptive moral injury. As he notes powerfully, war changes us forever. As he puts it, here is an ancient question. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? He goes on to reflect on the fact that the log or the speck in his eye will not go away. And while it is painful to live with the memories of actions in contexts of war, he wishes it would fade. He also asks us as readers to recognize that moral injury is about human relationship. And as such, memories are instructive. He values the fact that the memory reminds him of our humanity and the humanity against whom war is waged. He articulates the challenging memories of engaging in war, again from the Christian Century essay, as the winds that blow when all the laws, all the understood ways of relating to other human beings have been laid flat. Dr. Yandel articulates the way moral injury lingers, troubles, instructs, invites our deeper reflection. His honesty also helps anyone who seeks to walk beside a combat veteran. Michael's essay in Christian Century and his chapter in the Center's book, Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care, illustrate well the ways the work of the Center lies not only in informing our understanding of war and its consequences for veterans and their families, but also for understanding the afterlife of war, which is one way I understand military moral injury. Michael wrote this as a younger man. One also hears such stories accompanying veterans at other stages of life as they risk speaking of such memories. In my own essay in the same volume, Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care, I turn to the story of Jacob wrestling with the Spirit, the presence of the Holy One, as he faces the ways he failed to be the brother to Esau or human being he was called to be. The wrestling at the Jabbok, you'll recall, left him with a limp and a new name. And he embraced a future that was shaped by accomplishment and value to others. These two references suggest the compass that guided my efforts to recruit webinars to inform military personnel, VA chaplains, and religious leaders in congregations where veterans and their children may well be present. My hope is that these webinars and the ones that will follow, guided by new leadership, equip us to hear and respond to the afterlife of moral injury, and to assist all those who find the courage to reckon with their own experiences of receptive and agential moral injury. I know that my own journey is deeply enriched by the privilege of the conversations I have had with those I approached to provide leadership in a webinar. Often those conversations involved perhaps 30, 15, 20, many minutes of thinking together and their reflections on what it is they might share and the journey it would be to do so. I also am aware of the particular challenge for military chaplains and congregational leaders who walk beside veterans and active duty personnel. General William Green, Chief of Chaplains for the Army, put it well in a recent message entitled Spiritual Readiness. It is included in the November 2023-2024 webinar, which is now available on our website and the VOA site. Last year, I was privileged to present on moral injury to faculty and students in the colleges of nursing and social work at TCU. I was impressed with the volume of literature in those two professions that resonate with military moral injury, but helpfully illustrate how the experience of moral injury has a wide reach. This is true especially across professions that include encounters with people at risk, and the challenge for those who are authorized to assess and respond to their needs. Michael Yandel's words linger. I think about the multiple contexts in which we are vulnerable to receptive and agential moral injury. My hope is that our webinars and those to come will prove useful for civilians and for military contexts. Working with colleagues at Brite and at VOA, and the many conversations with people regarding their participation in webinars, have left me with deep gratitude for Rita's early work on this topic and her decision to reach out to Brite to house the center. My hope is that our website, carefully tended by Vanessa, will be a repository to which many turn. It's also, of course, at the VOA Center. But we created these webinars and we stored many resources precisely because we want to expand awareness of the power of moral injury, and especially awareness for resources to respond to those affected by it. Now I am looking forward to your insights and questions and the conversation that we will have with the time remaining in this webinar. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nancy, for those wonderful reflections and thoughts and quotes and points of interest that are thought-provoking and important. Before we open the conversation up to everyone else, I think we're going to have a little bit of a conversation here with the people. And I want to introduce Kyle Fauntleroy at Brite Divinity School, who is a good friend and was on the original board of the Soul Repair Center. And he's going to introduce one of our special guests today.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our new president at Brite Divinity School, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Cady, who's been with us somewhere between 11 and 12 months. He hadn't even been here a year yet. Stephen got his PhD at Princeton. He did his MDiv at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, and his bachelor's at Ohio Wesleyan. Go Fighting Bishops. He came to us from Asbury First United Methodist Church in Rochester, New York. So he's got his first pair of boots. He hasn't gotten a hat yet, but he's close. And we are thrilled to have him here as part of the Brite family. Stephen.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, the battling bishops, as somebody put in the chat. Just not the fighting bishops, the battle. But that's good. No, I wanted to just take a moment to, on behalf of the entire Brite community, say thank you to Dr. Nancy Ramsay for her hard work, for her graciousness, for her wisdom, for her insight, and for her care as she has shepherded the Soul Repair Center for all of these years. It is, as I said last week to a group of folks, the Soul Repair Center is the part of Brite that has the most reach of anything that we do. It reaches more folks in the course of a single year than any other program that we put on, any other lecture that we have, anything else. It has the single greatest reach of anything. And that would not be the case without the hard work of the folks who are on this panel, and more importantly, for the last several years, Dr. Nancy Ramsay. So I want to say thank you for all that you've done and all that you do. I also want to recognize that the Soul Repair Center doesn't stop here. It is something that we are committed to at Brite Divinity School, and we are going to take a little bit of time over the next couple of months to be able to look for and bring in new leadership who can help us take the Soul Repair Center and run with it even further. What's nice is an organization like this, because of the great leadership that Nancy has provided, is able to build upon a really strong foundation. And my prayer is that this is something that will continue to have ripple effects. I mean, it was moving to hear that even in the kinds of folks that came around the conversation from the very inception of this, the kinds of work that has spawned from that initial conversation, my prayer is that not for Brite's sake, but for the world's sake, we might be able to continue to invest in these conversations and moral injury, and maybe, just maybe, make a difference in the lives of so many people out there who are trying to find their way to fullness of life in the wake of moral injury. And I am so grateful to be able to support that as an institution, and so grateful for the work that has been done that we can build upon. So I just wanted to say this is something that we're going to continue. It doesn't stop here, and that we are looking forward to the ways that this will continue to bear fruit in the years to come.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
And on behalf of an ex-Brite person, welcome to Brite
Thank you.
School.
Yes. Yes.
Delighted that you're part of the community now. I wanted to say also, one of the things that is a feature of the way Nancy organizes things is she always thinks of the diversity first. She doesn't look around the room and say, "Oh, we need some diversity." It's there from the very beginning. And that was true of our advisory board, as well as that senior theologians panel that she convened. And so several of the members of the advisory board, like Amir Hussein, who wound up president of the American Academy of Religion, was willing to write an essay for a book that Joe McDonald, who I see is here today, that's moral injury in sacred texts. And he wrote an amazing essay on Joseph in the Quran, not the Bible, but the Quran. We had Buddhist and other different essays, but the advisory board reflected that diversity in its makeup because of Nancy's recruitment, on the top of which she got the provost at TCU interested in this work. And even before I started my job at the Soul Repair Center, she got the provost, to give me 10 minutes at a dean's meeting of all the deans at TCU to talk about this new thing that was going to come to Brite. And I was told strictly 10 minutes was all I had. So I had my little PowerPoint, and I got up there and did my little PowerPoint. And then the provost proceeded to ask me 20 minutes worth of questions after that. So he was very engaged with it as well. So we immediately had friends at TCU because of Nancy's work with the deans. And in fact, the dean of nursing wound up on the advisory committee. And then when she put that panel of senior pastoral theologians together, it wasn't just the one book. It was Larry Graham did an entire book by himself, Moral Injury, Restoring Wounded Souls. And some of them wrote for other collections. And so, and all of that happened at the Soul Repair Center in 2012 because we were just early in the conversation.
Right. And I want to jump in to say that the conversation with those scholars was so rich.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Carrie has gone on to do tremendous work. Obviously we started by co-editing that book, but it spawned a lot of conversation. And Rita, it's the work you brought to us. It was easy to build on it because it was so insightful and it was just waiting to be named.
Well, when I went to Lily, I said, this is a natural for religious folks. The clinicians have been doing the essays, but really we religious folks know what this is. But it's what struck me about it was I have a minor in psych, and I've done a fair amount of work crossing over into psychology and science and other things. And it was the first time I had ever read a clinical essay. And the essay said at the end, well, this is just a little of what's possible in therapy, but really we need the support of communities, especially religious communities, to do the full recovery process. And I thought, wait, did they just say religion was valuable? Did they just say they needed us? That was the moment when I said, oh, okay, this is something we should teach churches to, this is something we should teach chaplains and clergy about. So, and that was just an essay in 2009. That's how new all of this still really is. It's not very long, 15 years. So,
I know, Rita, I'm sorry, I thought that was a period.
yeah.
Excuse me.
Go ahead. No, so it's it's been an unfolding. I think it just keeps unfolding, and it all began at Brite.
I was going to say that I was really, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was certainly pleased to find how rich the literature on moral injury is in other helping professions, as I named both social work and nursing. It was a lot of work to prepare for those webinars, for those presentations to them, rather, because there was so much. I wish that I had, recruited people from those professions, had I known about it earlier, to be on our webinars, because it would have been useful for chaplains to make those connections with their colleagues, but probably at least in hospital settings, they already were. The group I wish we had, I hope we continue, I hope we can further contact or impress would be clergy, to be more, to listen, to overhear moral injury in the conversations that they have.
And also, we in our certificate program in moral injury for Volunteers of America, we get clergy with their own moral injury.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, there are all kinds of reasons that they come with that, but they've never had a place to talk about it before. So this has been a real gift, and it couldn't have happened without Nancy giving us a home for that Lilly money that she got the faculty to vote it so fast. We had several other schools very interested, but they were delaying. Two were in presidential searches. They didn't want to do it until they had a new president. Another one was going to take a year to get it through their faculty process. And so Brite was the first to say yes. We want it. And then Kyle immediately contacted me. It's great. Yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Well, I was just going to say one of the most important events that we had before the pandemic was that community engagement that we mustered up here at Brite in our conference center, and we had over 40 folks there representing almost 20 religions and nonprofit groups, and the engagement was remarkable.
It was.
And that kind of gave us the momentum into when we had to sequester ourselves because of the pandemic and move to the webinar format. And these, we've had as many as 200 people on webinars. We've had as little as 10 or 15. But the views later on that the webinars are getting on the website is a wonderful resource and an ongoing resource.
I agree. Yeah. It's
and
also research.
Yep.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just
changing
saying
the
that,
subject, so go ahead.
No, every time, whenever I am in a position and I'm to speak about it, I try to underscore for my colleagues, especially in pastoral theology, because that's a very appropriate field and connects with CPE, for example, that there is just a treasure trove now of very thoughtful presentations that the folks we've recruited have offered. And I particularly remember, I think it was last year, Kyle, just some terrific work by VA chaplains. And, you know, for me, having been a pastor, those webinars would be invaluable for a pastor preparing to visit, either in a hospital setting or in a home, a veteran that likely has some memories that veteran has not shared, perhaps with the family, much less the pastor. But to know about that at the time of that visit is very important. And I hope that we can gain a wider and wider audience with the work of the center with religious leaders. But I am very grateful that we were able to work together across the Abrahamic tradition, because I think that adds a lot to our work. And it says something about Brite that we could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things at the Soul Repair Center, this was a sort of bridge thing that happened when I moved over to Volunteers of America. We had already invited the Director of Veteran Services for Volunteers of America to the board, a psychiatrist named John Sharon. And I had been working with Tim Barth over in psychology at TCU and with several other community folks about including Paul Payne, who was the commander at Carswell till he retired and is with Fort Worth South. And we were trying to come up with a transition out of the military, because the more I worked on this, the more I became convinced that the military transition out was terrible. And that if they got an adequate transition out, a lot of the things that happen to veterans that are meltdowns and difficulties could be prevented. Not everything, but a lot of that could be prevented with a better transition out, and sort of boot camp out idea. And we were working on this proposal and working on it. And I showed it to the board, and John Sharon from Volunteers of America said, well, why don't you do it with veterans? We have a lot of veterans we serve. You could just put this out, it's like do something like this for veterans. And so that seemed like a great idea. And so we convened a planning committee to design something. We just had the sort of idea to do it. And so we pulled this planning committee to, including Cheryl Kajawa Holbrook, who was the dean at Claremont, and Jonathan Shea, who's the sort of grandfather of all things moral injury, and his partner at the Boston VA that he worked with for 20 years, Jim Monroe. The two of them co-chaired this group. We had a Zen priest, we had a Marine Corps peer specialist veteran. It was a hodgepodge committee of all vested interests, as it were, and an Episcopal priest who had a doctorate in ritual studies, and then Kristen Leslie, who's like the expert on military sexual trauma. And they worked for an entire 4-day weekend nonstop and created a 50-hour, 10-week program that Volunteers of America said they would pay for, since we were wanting to try it out with the veteran population there. And then they hired me then to move over and run that project. And John was supposed to help me do it because he was head of their veteran services. And a couple of months before I went to VOA, he got moved over to become director of mental health services for Los Angeles County, which was the biggest such thing in the United States. So he didn't have time to help me. So I sort of wound up over there. But I was so grateful to have the kind of committee I could put together because of all the contacts that Nancy and I had made at the Soul Repair Center. And who would have even guessed that the first group of veterans we tested that program with were all veterans that were women, was very racially and age diverse, and we even had a major in the group, but all of those women had military sexual trauma.
Right.
I was so grateful Kristen had been on that planning committee,
right,
and had given us good advice about how to handle that. And that we had facilitators, this is peer facilitated. We had trained facilitators that had advice in their manual about what how to understand military sexual trauma and how to handle it. And one of those facilitators was a man, a male veteran. And we told him, you need to tell he understood this. He said, I'll tell them I will leave if they don't want me there. I understand that women may not be comfortable with talking with a man in the room. And so he told them that. They were fine with him being there. They never asked him to leave. They loved him at the end. He was a great guy. And the stories, the miracles that came out of that original group of women was just astonishing. And half of them wanted to train to facilitate the program.
Right.
Just
I'd like to build on. I'm sorry. I thought you were finished.
Kristen, she's here today too. Thank you
Yeah.
for taking the time to be on that committee. It was invaluable to us.
She is definitely an early and important and continuing voice. I wanted to add that I think that especially the first year when I was, and maybe into the second, the number of women survivors that contacted me was substantial. And they really needed they wanted to share what had happened. So I needed to debrief myself from that. I'm glad that they called. And it really underscored for me how important it was to publicly, hold the military accountable, to take it to them. And the year, I think it was 2019, that they had a conference at Duke, they privileged our center by inviting me to come and speak. And I was also part of the earlier conversation. General Green was there with leadership in the Army, and I was able to present there as well. And I figured, it's time to. This is my opportunity. I went on and just spoke quite directly about how serious this problem was, and I'm grateful for leaders like General Green, who came up to me and said, call me anytime after that presentation. But I was certainly trembling in speaking so directly. But the need was so important. And the shift now, as I mentioned briefly in my comments, to being able to go to bypass the command structure and have special prosecutors is such an important transition in all three branches for protection. There are more steps that need to happen, but that was an important theme for us, I think, and a part of our presence in addressing moral injury. And I knew part of what I appreciated was that I knew I could do it at Brite, because that's an important part of who Brite is, of making a prophetic witness. And that's part of why I knew you would be welcome, Rita. And it wasn't a new theme for us, but it was, I'd heard too many stories. It was time to be direct. And of course, we also had programs where it wasn't just women that experienced military sexual trauma. It isn't, I should say, present tense. And we also had good presenters to help us think through that. So part of what I appreciate was the way in which Brite was a context in which we could have a webinar on any topic that was important to name. And that's not true in a number of other places. And I'm sure that will continue to be the case at Brite.
Yeah, and you're right about that. There's sort of what people call radioactive topics you just don't talk about. And so I think we handled all the radioactive ones in the series.
So, Rita.
Yeah, we went through
My
a
hair
lot
wasn't
of that.
this color when I started. Right?
Yeah.
Well,
No,
I think an example of that. Well, I can think of lots of examples of that, but one that you will remember quickly, Nancy, is with General Xenakis and shoulder-fired weapons, the training with shoulder-fired weapons. That's gone to Congress now.
Yes, I know. I was cheering that on. Yes. Yeah. And that happened because a survivor of that wrote me, a student at UNC, And I reached out to General Xenakis and said, what do you think? Because he had had an article on it. And I really am grateful for his courage and readiness to work with the student. And the student was already going to driving up from Chapel Hill to Washington to lobby. And good for him.
Yeah.
And good for us. Yeah. I'm glad we were part of that.
We've got a question on the chat from Dr. Joe McDonald, speaking of Brite Divinity School. He'd like to hear from both Nancy and Rita. What do you think are the most important, say, one or two potential trajectories for the future of moral injury research or engagement? Which contexts have only just need to begin grappling with these issues?
I can jump in on that one because we're looking at doing a conference next year on an area I think that is too neglected in moral injury work, which is collective and historical legacies of moral injury. And one of the people on our planning committee is Joseph Winnicke-Leiden, who is employed at the Southern Poverty Law Center, who believes that moral injury is at the root of the energy and hate groups.
Yes.
And so and there are the because the original work and emphasis and interest in moral injury came out of the clinical community, it's been more focused on individuals' experiences and recovery processes. But I think there are long, extensive legacies of moral injury that are historical and unresolved. I think the United States for a very long time has been relitigating the Civil War. I think we're back at it again with the rise in Nazism. And so those are unaddressed experiences of moral injury, I think, that carry through and get transmitted through generations. And then there are what I think we are looking at right now, the systems that are immoral, systems that inflict harm, that create collective experiences of moral injury, which can become highly volatile as people react. And how do you address moral injury in ways that help people use that emotional energy for positive change rather than for reactionary resistance or for destructive energies that want to tear down a system. So I think that those are really powerful and important. The legacies, there's the sexual abuse of priests, those stories. There's so many legacies of moral injury in addition to harmful systems. And I think we are also seeing this collective harmful process emerge. Well, it isn't emerging; it's been there, but being attended to more because of the pandemic, which is the messed up healthcare system we have. And how shocked people were when the head of a healthcare company was assassinated, and how and not only that he was assassinated, but people see the assassin, the person who murdered him, as a hero.
Yeah.
But that tells you how furious and upset. I mean, that kind of murderous energy is a sign, I think, of a system that's bringing people to that point, to valorize somebody who just point blank decided to kill someone.
Yeah.
So I think those are areas that need to be looked at, and we're looking at trying to bring a woman from South Africa that just won the Templeton Prize. She has been she worked with the Truth Commission in South Africa with Desmond Tutu. Her name is Puma Gobadoma Dikizela. And she works on how you process in a society violence and harm when the perpetrators and victims all live in the same country afterwards. And she's been working with Germans and children of the Holocaust and issues around that. But she also has been working in South Africa in relation to what's happened there post-apartheid. And she calls the work she does restorative humanism.
Interesting.
But I think you can't get at these big questions by looking at individual recovery, as much as that's important for the individuals. And we're hearing this more and more. Michael Yandel, who's here today, also has been teaching in our moral injury certificate program, and our whole teaching team has been hearing around the edges of the people that come to that. What about the collective things? What about the group things?
Is that a period or a pause? Okay.
That's a period. You see the little.
Okay. I'm looking. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. It's typical of you to ask such a rich question. I think of several things. Were I continuing, one of the webinars I would have developed had to do with nurses, and particularly nurses in the military, but nurses in general. Because as I prepared for the presentation to the School of Nursing, I just found a lot of literature, and I wish that I had interviewed some military nurses, because you can imagine what they witness and encounter, and I think that that's a really important lacuna, at least in our collection at Brite. So that would be one of the ways forward that I envision. Another would be for us to go much deeper in racism. The energy in the presentation that we did last December, I think, yes, on racism in the military. Kyle, correct me if that's the wrong month, but it was around then. Well, you're silenced, but that was, I was taken aback to realize, well, ashamed too, that we hadn't addressed it. And it's a plaguing problem in the military as it is in our whole national life. So I would say that there's a lot more that needs to be done about that, not only for African Americans, but as our webinar suggested, certainly for Asian Americans as well, and Latinos. We had planned for a Latino to be part of that panel, and in the end, that wasn't possible. But there's much for our culture, and therefore the military, that arises, from this culture to address on that issue. It's a very serious problem. So I would say racism and I want to learn more, as I said, about Native Americans and their experience of moral injury. That's one of the topics I'm researching now is settler colonialism.
Yeah.
And it's a topic rife with morally injurious actions. So I think that those are a few of the edges that I see for the work forward. I'd be very interested in what you've identified.
Kyle, do you have areas that you'd like to see more research done in?
No, I'm glad the racism topic came up. I mean, just getting resources for that particular webinar was work. And
Yeah,
a lot of people had experiences, had opinions, but did not feel at liberty
right,
to express them publicly.
right.
And
I agree.
it was, I mean, the military is so diverse ethnically. And but we don't see that diversity necessarily reflected in leadership.
Right, right.
I mean, I can speak to the Navy Chaplain Corps. We've only had one African American chief of chaplains, and we've only had one woman chief of chaplains in our history. So I think that's a field that merits more exploration.
Absolutely. The delicacy of Kyle and I worked closely on developing that webinar, and the delicacy of it was remarkable. And I agree, Kyle, that it and the fact that one of the folks representing the Latino population felt it was too difficult. It was too painful. And now, I mean, it's even more apparent how important it is to address that. But we've just scratched the surface when we began that. That's a good first webinar, but it must not be the last. And we really only scratched the surface in terms of Native Americans as well. It was a start, but can't be the last. Especially, I think a webinar on schools, boarding schools, would be useful as well.
So, question I have is, what kind of risk is now being posed to people who might have been in the military when they did these webinars? Or what kind of dampening effect will the current situation have for the possibility of even having webinars as courageous as the ones we've done in the past few years?
A terrifying question, because it's so on point.
I mean, we have to. Everybody's shutting down their DEI, and I don't want to use the initials. I want to say diversity, equity, and inclusion programs by mandate, federal mandate. I mean, universities can't teach to it, otherwise they'll lose their federal funding.
Same with nonprofits.
Pell Grants specifically.
Yeah.
I think that's serious stuff.
Yeah, any teaching institution with federal scholarship aid capacity to accept federal scholarship aid for its students is now threatened.
Well, specifically, what does it say about the GI Bill? You know, that so many guys coming out of so many young people coming out of the military count on for education.
That's right.
I mean, where can they go to school? I mean, that's huge.
Because we've had astonishing webinars, actually, in terms of taboo subjects we've been willing to talk about with people willing to be public.
Right.
Yeah. Veterans, unless you work for the VA, in which case you may be also at risk.
And TCU's got about 400 veterans as students, and I don't know how many of that number, but I would guess the vast majority are on the GI Bill.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't have an answer to that question. I just am very aware of the financial risks now being posed by caring about racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all of those phobias and oppressions.
I know I'm not on the official panel here, but I just
yes, good.
Okay, I wanted to weigh in on this particular question, recognizing that I do think we're in a strange moment, and we are not at the end of this moment. We're at just the beginning of it, and we're going to have to kind of feel our way through. But I can speak at the very least for my commitments at Brite, which is, we can't roll back DEI at Brite Divinity School because it is essential to who we are. And so we're not focusing on DEI in spite of being people of faith. We're doing it because we're people of faith. And to take that out of our curriculum, to take that out of our emphasis or focus or values as an institution would be to remove the fundamental aspect of who we are. So it is a strange moment, but so long as I'm here, I have every intention of making sure that we continue to sin boldly in our conversations and in the programs that we put on. Soul repair needing to be at the center of that.
Yeah.
So I just want to weigh in on that one, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a serious question. We have a question in the chat about if moral injury could be let me just read it. I would want to know if moral injury, which I could categorize as traumatic experience, have any implication on the families of the victims, specifically on education performance of the children of the victims. This relates, I think, to the intergenerational nature of.
That's what I was trying to figure out. To victims, which ones? We've talked about several. So if the person wants to add that.
There's a woman named Mariana Hirsch who's done very interesting work studying the novels and art and output of children of Holocaust victims. And she uses a term called post-memory, which is similar, I think, to moral injury. But she makes a case that what happens to the children of some Holocaust victims is that they begin to feel as if their own lives are small and trivial compared to what their parents went through and the magnitude of the harm their parents went through. And so they are sort of, their lives are sort of swallowed by that legacy of the trauma of the parents, to the point that they dedicate their own lives to holding on to and making known and writing literature on the basis of having the parents' trauma as their life purpose. And she calls that post-memory, that she found this to be a phenomenon. And she herself is a child of Holocaust survivors, so she also thought that she detected it to some extent in herself. And I think what she's talking about is the receiving of traumatic memory, not a memory of trauma, but traumatic memory, as then entering the second generation also as traumatic memory because it remains unprocessed.
Right.
And as a therapist, I mean, I did study some of the therapeutic stuff on PTSD, and really what happens is that your right brain is your trauma brain, and your memories of trauma are stored in a chaotic form in your right brain. It's also your creative love brain too. And so it's not it's a very invaluable part of your personality, but if you're traumatized, that also goes there. And the trick, or the process of treatment, is to help people access this. It's not memory stored through your hippocampus memory processing system. It goes directly to your trauma brain and doesn't get processed as memory. So it comes back as flashbacks, as a painful thing, right? And so to get it over to your executive brain that can think about it and begin to process it is what you have to do so that it's trauma, a memory of trauma rather than a traumatizing memory. It's sort of the distinction I would make. And I think that when parents have unprocessed trauma, they're more likely to pass on some of that to their children. I don't know what the educational
Didn't
performance
Larry Graham
is.
publish
Yeah.
something on subsequent generations?
Uh-huh.
Weapons?
Uh-huh.
He did.
Oh, interesting. There's another topic in the chat.
Generational trauma.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah.
I think about the deportations going on and how that the longevity of that. Of course, it's simply building on the trauma that brought people here.
Right.
So it's quite. I certainly think it's substantial. I worry about those of us who identify as white. How are we processing this? If it's indifferent, that's a matter of indifference. That's in itself problematic. I mean, it's certainly morally injurious. Um, and whether one speaks or not becomes a substantial ethical question. I think whether one protests, or writes a letter to an editor, what speaks to a representative, but this is and it is an important illustration of current morally injurious actions. I agree. I'm glad you raised it, Rita.
Yeah. The person was asking about veterans and the children of veterans with moral injury. And as I recall, and I'd have to look it up now, Bill Nash led a team that wrote an article on the impact of moral injury on families. I don't know if children specifically were referred to, but I know that he has written on that topic. His name is William P. Nash. I'm sure if you Googled those topic words with his name, it would pop up. William P. Nash is his name. He's one of the authors on the original Brett Litt's moral injury essay, and he's also international expert on combat stress and worked with the Los Angeles VA before he worked for the UN Office of Operations. He's now retired, but he's the kind of humanist that cares about these kinds of questions, the impact on families and things.
Right.
Also a career naval officer.
Naval psychiatrist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They did a lot of work during the over in Iraq with us.
Second Battle of Fallujah. His Marine Corps was he was
Right.
deployed with his Marine Corps unit to the Second Battle of Fallujah. Yeah.
It's relevant for moral injury in terms of Pauline Boss wrote about you could be physically present but emotionally absent as veterans, or emotionally present in a family but physically absent. And I think that's painfully relevant for the emerging situation for folks that will be forced to leave. But it's also morally injurious to know that this order could completely contradict the image that the country promoted up until this time.
I can tell you what it is like to be the child of a combat veteran. My father, he was an automatic rifleman at Normandy, but he never talked about World War II, so we didn't know that. I didn't know that none of us knew that about him until I was able to get his military record. He died in 1976, 8 years after he came back from his second deployment to Vietnam as a medic. And the father who came home from Vietnam was not the father I knew who raised me.
Right.
I was going off to college when he came home, and we fought a lot because he was very controlling, and hadn't been that way before, and it turned into at one point a physical fight with him, and I left home and didn't live at home anymore after my freshman year. So I didn't really I don't think I was resolved about my memory about my father until I learned about moral injury, and accidentally was in Mississippi. He was from Mississippi, and he was close to one of his cousins, and I was close to her as well. And I was visiting her. She's quite elderly by this time. And she usually asks me what I'm working on. And I told her I was writing a book on moral injury. And she said, "What's that?" So I told her what was stress from war and combat. And she looked at me and she said, "Well, I think that's what your daddy had." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, he found the body of that girl." And I said, "What girl?" He said, "Well, she was like a spy or something for him." And I said, "Well, I know he had a 16-year-old Vietnamese bilingual translator who went with him into the villages, because the army was encouraging medics to treat the villagers. And so he would carry a backpack full of aspirin and bandages and things. And she would go with him on that. I knew he had written about that. And he was very proud of her. She was my age. She was a young Asian girl, my age. And he was using her as a translator. And he would write about how smart she was and talented. And I said, "You mean the translator that?" And she said, "Well, she said, I don't know exactly what she was, but he found her body." And I said, "What do you mean he found her body?" And she said, "Well, she'd been raped and murdered by the troops." Um, and I just was stunned. It explained a lot about his controlling behavior and his coldness and angriness. But I think how different he was impacted my younger siblings a lot more, because I had gone off to college and they had 8 years with him. So it's a real sense of betrayal when someone you're waiting and longing to survive so they can come home to you comes home and you don't want to be around them.
I was speaking at a local congregation last Sunday about moral injury. And two older gentlemen, both in their 80s, came up to me. And their dads were in World War II. And they said, this is new language for me, and I wish I had it earlier in life. Nancy, you and I have talked about this.
Right, we have both of our fathers.
Lots and lots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a 100-year-old friend named Uncle. He's the uncle of Rebecca Parker, who's a good friend of mine. I've been sort of adopted in the family, so I also call him Uncle David. And he came in at the age of 95 on one of those honor flights from Seattle, Washington to Baltimore. And I was living in the DC area at the time, so I met his plane with a big sign, "Welcome, Uncle David," and his son Bruce was pushing his wheelchair. And we had a little reunion, and he was so excited to be there. And they invited me to come back for the closing dinner. They're only there for like a day or so. Those are very short trips. But so they invited me to the closing dinner as their guest. And so I drove back to Baltimore for the dinner and was sitting at a table with Uncle David and Bruce, and then a whole other table of mostly Vietnam era vets. And I just was going to enjoy this dinner, and Uncle David announces to the table, "This woman here, she's working on moral injury." Because he and I had several conversations about his experience in World War II. And they all, "What's that? What's that?" So I gave my little 2-minute definition of it, and they went, "Oh, what?" And they also suddenly started to talk about it. And Well, and David and Bruce and I had already talked about, so we talked about something else, but I could hear this chatter going on around the table, and I heard this voice rise up sort of loud over the chatter, and that lady over there, she knows what she's talking about. And then the guy said, they've been treating me for PTSD, but that isn't my problem. It's moral injury. That was from a 2-minute definition.
Yeah.
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 You know what you've just shared, I'm going to circle back to my continued hope that we are more effective, the center, in informing religious leaders who are privileged to have many conversations with persons and as life shortens, and but also in their congregation that could be a more recent veteran. But I know that it would be so important toward the end of life, especially if one could listen for clues and had some sense of what one was hearing, or invite, if you knew this was a veteran, invite, or tell me more about that. Because the code of silence is so substantial. I do remember when my father, a World War II veteran, came back from an honor flight to go see the World War II memorial, and how pleased he was that this was there, that they had honored these veterans by taking them there, and treated them well. But it meant a lot to him to have that experience, and that's part of what prompts me to say that I want more clergy, religious leaders, to be mindful of this, as well as the other categories that we've named of professionals. Rita, we're coming near the end of the time, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any last thoughts, Nancy, about all of these years you've been working with the center and moral injury?
Several. I certainly want to, again say how grateful I am for the conversations that persons privileged me to have. It, especially during COVID, it was weighty sometimes, but I wouldn't trade the privilege of being able to receive that call, and for them to know they had somebody who would listen and who had a way of, and I had the language to name. This was especially conversation after conversation about sexual trauma, because that was kind of the first wave, I think, in response to your work, Rita, and our work. But I'm very grateful that you came to Brite with that idea, and that Brite has become at least one, prominently identified with being open to and ready to respond to what is clearly a plaguing, long overdue issue for us to address. And I'm also very grateful that we recognize the importance of forms of difference treated oppressively, and have been able to offer programming that demonstrates our recognition that this problem is as widespread as the range of persons are in the military, and that the military is plagued with the same issues that plague our culture, including racism and sexism and heterosexism. We might have passed some regulations about inclusion, but that changing the reality on the ground is a longer journey. And I'm grateful that Brite is working with you, Rita, and your organization to be part of the effort to name these problems within that umbrella of morally injurious realities. And bear witness, be a witness. I think that's what I have sought to bring to our program at Brite, because it was a place I could do that. And it was part of what led me to say, absolutely, Rita, come. We need that witness.
And I would say that I'm grateful, Nancy, that you did that, that you immediately hooked into it. I also want to say that in 2011, I had written a resolution for the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ that the church needed to attend to moral injury in veterans and to train ministers to understand this. And so one of the reasons I thought of Brite as a home for this was because Noel Williams was the moderator of the church at that assembly. And I thought, well, at least he will have heard the term. And maybe he even read the resolution, but he would have heard the term. And so of course he was open to it. And then he said I should contact you because the faculty would have to vote this and all that. But it was just that I happened to be a disciple and I wanted the church to take responsibility. This was also my denomination seminary. So all of those factors were why I thought of Brite as on the list of places we would try. And Herm wanted to try Calvin College because that was his alma mater. So there were we were tussling that out, but they happened to be looking for a president. So Brite won that battle, as it were, or we got there first. But what I want to say is that just the term moral injury in airports and like at that table with all those these very elderly veterans, that the term has opened more meaningful conversations in my life than I've ever had before. And I have met the most amazing human beings who have moral injury.
Yes.
Once you get them talking and that part of them that struggles comes out, you see this amazing human being. It's like you can't, if you have moral injury, it means you have a conscience.
Right.
And the person who's struggling that much has a complex and important conscience. And you get through the story, you get through the moral pain that they're feeling, and you find these amazing human beings that do glorious things. They write amazing books, like Michael Yandel. I met him his first semester at Brite. At the new student reception, somebody said, there's an Iraq veteran in this class. I thought, wow, that's great. It's my first semester at Brite. We'll see if I can find him. And of course, he was the only one in the room with tattoos. It wasn't too hard to find him, but to have had, and then of course his colleagues at Emory, like Joseph Winnicke-Leiden and Brian Powers and a whole bunch of people that he went through Emory with in his PhD program, all working on moral injury. But the veterans that have come through the program that I pilot tested at Volunteers of America, some of them still work for us as facilitators. They're amazing. They're just amazing. And Kyle is one of those amazing people I met doing this work. So Kyle, do you have last words?
I'm just grateful to be back here. And the last 5 years, Nancy, have been superlative and rich.
Thank you.
Even when they break our heart, they're rich. We hear these stories and meet these remarkable souls. Like our webinar in January with Melissa McCafferty.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Talk about courage.
Right. Right.
So I cherish this and can't wait to see what the future holds for the center.
And I think that would be Stephen with the last word.
So as I said at the beginning, there's such a big word of gratitude in this moment for all the hard work that has gone into making Soul Repair what it is now. I want to say once again, thank you to Nancy Ramsay, Dr. Nancy Ramsay, for her her work and her spirit, and for all the blood, sweat, and tears that she put into making this possible. And you have set us up for success moving forward, and we will take that and run with it, and look for more information very soon in the in the next couple of months, as we just take a moment to regroup and to center ourselves. And our hope would be to have something up as soon as we possibly can, but beginning again in the fall, so that we can continue this great work.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good news.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you all for your questions and for being here today to celebrate.
Thank you.
Thank you.